The first thing David saw wasn't the eviction notice. It was the trampled soil, the snapped stems of his late wife's heirloom roses. The air, usually thick with the sweet, peppery scent of the Evelyn blooms, was choked with the acrid smell of injustice. A single muddy boot print, deep and angry, was stamped into the heart of the garden bed like a grave marker. Then his eyes lifted to the front door, where the stark white paper was taped, its bold black letters screaming a verdict he hadn't known was coming. He felt the world tilt, the manicured silence of the Cypress Creek subdivision suddenly roaring in his ears. This wasn't just a notice. It was a declaration of war, and Bartholomew Thorne, the HOA president, had just made the catastrophic mistake of firing the first shot. He thought he was fighting a retired structural engineer. He had no idea he was about to contend with the full, methodical wrath of a man who had nothing left to lose and a daughter who dismantled threats for a living. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this kind of HOA power reaches. This isn't just my fight. It's yours too. It all began 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday that felt like any other sweltering Florida afternoon. The air was a wet blanket, smelling of impending rain and freshly cut St. Augustine grass. David sat on his back lanai, the worn wicker creaking a familiar rhythm, nursing a glass of iced tea that was sweating more than he was. He was sketching a new trellis design for the climbing clematis, a project his wife Helen had always wanted. Grief was a quiet houseguest, and the garden was the only place they could still speak. The sharp, cheerful chirp of a cardinal drew his eyes to the new bird feeder he'd hung from the old oak tree. It was a simple thing, a redwood cylinder filled with sunflower seeds, but watching the flurry of blue jays and painted buntings was a small, bright spot in the gray expanse of his new life. A shadow fell over his sketchbook. Afternoon, David. Tiwim. Voice was as dry as autumn leaves. Bartholomew Thorne stood at the edge of his property line, a ruler-straight crease in his khaki shorts. Thorne, a man of 60-something with a permanently pinched face and the self-satisfied posture of a retired county commissioner, which he was, ran the Cypress Creek HOA like a tin-pot dictator ruling a kingdom of beige houses. He carried a leather-bound clipboard everywhere, his personal scepter of suburban tyranny. The air around him seemed to smell of stale coffee and superiority. "Bartholomew," David said, his voice even. He didn't stand. Thorne's gaze flicked to the bird feeder, a tiny muscle twitching in his jaw. "That's a new addition." It wasn't a question. "A weekend project," David replied, taking a slow sip of his tea, the cold glass a small comfort against his palm. Section 4, Article 2, Subsection C of the Cypress Creek Covenants. "Conditions and restrictions," Thorne recited, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "No artificial structures intended to attract wildlife, including but not limited to bird feeders, squirrel platforms, or deer licks, shall be visible from the street or any adjacent property." He tapped his clipboard with a manicured finger. "Yours is visible from my kitchen window. It's an eyesore and attracts rodents." David looked from the feeder, a tiny beacon of life, to Thorne's sterile, perfectly mulched yard, a place so devoid of nature it looked like a computer rendering. "It attracts birds, Bartholomew. That's rather the point." "The bylaws are the bylaws," Thorne said, his voice hardening. "You have 48 hours to remove it, or a fine of $50 per day will be levied. It's all in the handbook you received at closing." He turned, his orthopedic sneakers making no sound on the lush grass, and marched back to his own beige castle. David stared after him. A knot of anger, cold and tight, formed in his stomach. He'd lived in this house for 30 years, long before. Cypress Creek was even a registered HOA. He and Helen had bought the plot when it was just a stretch of palmetto scrub and longleaf pine. They'd built this house with their own hands, planted every tree, laid every stone in the garden path. The HOA had slithered in a decade ago, a necessary evil, they'd been told, to protect property values. But it had metastasized under Thorne's presidency into something suffocating, a machine of petty rules and vindictive enforcement. This wasn't about bylaws. This was about control. That night, instead of sleeping, David found his original property deeds and the thick, dust-covered binder of HOA documents he'd been given. The scent of old paper and stale ink filled his study. He read for hours, the legal jargon swimming before his eyes. But as a structural engineer, he knew how to read blueprints, how to find the load-bearing walls and the hidden weaknesses in any system. And HOA's governing documents were no different. And there, buried in the fine print of the original incorporation papers, he found his first piece of ammunition. It stated that the declarations of covenants, conditions, and restrictions often have a grandfather clause for pre-existing structures if the HOA was formed after the home was built. His home predated the HOA by 2 decades. While the feeder was new, the principle of selective enforcement was a foundation he could potentially crack. It was a small detail, but in a war of attrition, you start with small victories. The bird feeder stayed. The first fine notice arrived, as promised. Then the second. David ignored them. He was documenting everything. The time of Thorne's visits, the wording of the notices, the clear view of 3 other bird feeders from his own backyard, all belonging to members of the HOA board. The hypocrisy was as thick as the summer humidity. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. The real escalation came a month later. It wasn't a notice on his door, it was an attack on his heart. The garden. Helen's garden was a riot of color and life, a testament to her vibrant spirit. It wasn't the sterile, HOA-approved landscape of perfectly spaced gardenias and monochrome hedges. It was a wild, English-style sanctuary of climbing, roses, unruly lavender, and sprawling beds of black-eyed Susans. It was, in Thorne's eyes, a chaotic mess. A certified letter arrived, its formal tone a thin veil for Thorne's venom. It cited Section 5, Article 1, demanding the immediate removal of non-native and unapproved flora. It listed Helen's prized David Austin roses as overgrown and the patch of wild butterfly weed as a noxious plant. The letter concluded that if the garden was not brought into aesthetic compliance within 14 days, the HOA would hire a landscaping company to do it for him and place a lien on his property for the cost. David's hands shook as he read it. He could feel the cold tile of the kitchen floor through his socks, hear the hum of the refrigerator, but it all felt distant. He walked outside, into the fragrant embrace of the garden. He touched a velvety petal of an Abraham Darby rose, its apricot pink hue the color of a sunrise Helen had loved. This wasn't just a garden, it was a living memorial. Every root, every leaf was a memory. Tearing it out would be like losing her all over again. He saw Thorne watching him from his window, a ghostly silhouette behind the pristine glass. The man wasn't just enforcing rules, he was deriving pleasure from this. David felt a surge of defiance, raw and powerful. He wouldn't just fight this, he would dismantle Thorne's little empire of misery, piece by petty piece. This HOA takedown was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. The scandal of their illegal overreach needed to be exposed. That evening, he called his daughter, Maya. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" Her voice, usually a calm, steady presence, sounded tired. She was stateside for a few weeks between deployments, a rare treat. David tried to keep his voice light, but the tremor of rage was hard to hide. "Just a little local politics. How's Quantico?" "Same old. Teaching a new batch of recruits how not to get themselves killed." "You sound stressed." He explained the situation, from the bird feeder to the certified letter about Helen's garden. He expected sympathy, maybe some practical advice. What he got was a pause, followed by a voice that had shifted from daughter to commander. The weariness was gone, replaced by a focused, chilling intensity. "He's putting a lien on the house for flowers?" Maya asked, the question sharp, analytical. "That's the threat. And you have the original deeds, predating the HOA's formation?" "Yes, I found them." "Okay," she said, and he could hear the faint sound of typing in the background. "I'm looking at Florida statutes now. An HOA's power isn't absolute, Dad. Their covenants can't supersede state or federal law, and they certainly can't be retroactively applied in a punitive way without clear, unambiguous consent. This whole thing smells illegal. The confidence in her voice was a balm to his frayed nerves. He'd seen her organize a chaotic family barbecue with the same effortless authority she used to command her teams. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. I'm not tearing down her garden, Maya. I won't. You won't have to, she said, her voice dropping slightly. This isn't about the garden anymore. This is about harassment and abuse of power. Men like Thorne, they're bullies. They count on people being too tired or too intimidated to fight back. We're not going to be either. I'm booking a flight for this weekend. We're going to war. David felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He wasn't alone in this. He looked out the window at Thorne's house, its windows dark save for the cold blue flicker of a television. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. The week that followed was a blur of quiet escalation. Thorne, emboldened by David's refusal to comply, began a campaign of low-grade psychological warfare. Cars would park in front of David's driveway for hours at a time, always belonging to a board member. His morning paper would be missing. He'd find small, deliberately placed piles of palm fronds on his lawn after his yard work was done. It was childish, pathetic, but deeply unnerving. The feeling of being watched was constant. The smell of Thorne's cloying aftershave seemed to linger by his mailbox. On Saturday morning, a white panel van from a company called Cypress Creek Security parked across the street. A man in a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform got out. He was thick-set, with a soft jaw and the bored, arrogant eyes of someone who enjoyed the sliver of authority he'd been given. He didn't do anything, just leaned against his van, smoking, a cigarette whose foul smoke drifted across the street, and watched David's house. This was Thorne's next move. An intimidation tactic designed to make David feel isolated and threatened. It was a classic bully's gambit. Create the illusion of overwhelming force. But Thorne didn't know who was arriving that afternoon. Maya's rental car, a nondescript Ford sedan, pulled into the driveway just after 3 p.m. She stepped out, and for a moment she was just his daughter. She wore simple yoga pants and a gray t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked tired from the flight. But then she looked at the security van, and her entire posture shifted. Her shoulders squared, her eyes narrowed with an unnervingly calm, analytical focus. It was a look David had seen before, on news clips from hostile territories he tried not to think about. It was the look of a predator identifying a threat. "So that's the palace guard?" she said, her voice a low murmur. "Showed up this morning," David said. Maya nodded, her eyes still locked on the man, who was now unsubtly taking a picture of her car with his phone. "Okay, let's go inside. You can brief me on the full situation. We're going to establish a baseline, document enemy tactics, and then we're going to dismantle his entire operation." The man across the street, whose name they would later learn was Carl, had no idea he'd just pointed a loaded gun at the woman who trains the men who hunt the world's most dangerous people. And the coming confrontation would expose a scandal that would bring the entire HOA crashing down, with justice as the final, beautiful verdict. The quiet suburban street transformed into a frozen tableau. The air, thick with the scent of ozone from the coming storm and freshly cut grass, now tasted metallic with fear. Carl, the self-styled security guard, stood on David's lawn, his hand clamped around the grip of a semi-automatic pistol. The weapon was pointed, trembling slightly, at Maya's chest. His face was a mask of blustering panic, his authority challenged and his ego wounded. He'd expected a cowering girl. He'd gotten a block of granite. David's heart seized, a cold fist closing around it. He took a half-step forward from the lanai, a guttural sound caught in his throat. "Dad, stay there," Maya commanded, her voice slicing through the tension. She hadn't taken her eyes off Carl. She hadn't even blinked. To David, time seemed to stretch and warp, every detail magnified. The tiny bead of sweat tracing a path down Carl's temple, the way his knuckles were white on the gun, the angry, red blotches blooming on his neck. "I told you to get back in the house," Carl barked, his voice cracking. "This is HOA business." Maya took one deliberate step forward, planting her feet in a subtly balanced stance. The movement was fluid, economical, and utterly terrifying in its confidence. You are on private property. You have drawn a weapon on a civilian without provocation. You have committed aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, a second-degree felony in the state of Florida. Your name is Carl Matthews. You have a B-class security license, which does not grant you peace officer status or the authority to brandish a firearm in this manner. You are, in legal terms, just a man with a gun committing a crime. Each word was a precise, devastating blow. Carl's face went from ruddy to pale. The hand holding the gun shook more violently. How do you know my name? I saw the patch on your ill-fitting shirt and the ID clipped to your belt 30 seconds after I got out of my car, Maya said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than Carl's shout. I also know that your stance is weak, your grip is improper, and your finger is resting on the trigger guard, not the trigger, which tells me you don't want to shoot. You want to scare me. You have failed. She took another step. David held his breath. Now, for the last time, you are going to place your weapon on the ground, slide it away, and leave this property. If you do not, I will be forced to disarm you, and I can assure you the experience will be profoundly unpleasant. It was the calm certainty in her voice that broke him. Carl looked from Maya's unyielding eyes to the windows of the neighboring houses where curtains were now twitching. He saw his pathetic power play collapsing into a career-ending, potentially prison-bound disaster. The entire insane HOA scandal he'd been paid to enforce was spiraling. With a choked sob of frustration, he lowered the gun, his movements clumsy. He fumbled with the weapon, placing it on the grass as if it were venomous. The moment the gun was down, Maya closed the distance in a blur. Before David could even process the movement, she had secured the weapon, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and had Carl's arm twisted behind his back in a compliance hold. He squealed, a pathetic, high-pitched sound. The police are on their way, she said, her voice now back to a normal, conversational tone as she spoke into the phone she'd seemingly materialized in her other hand. Yes, aggravated assault. The suspect is detained. She looked over her shoulder at her father. Dad, can you get me some zip ties from the garage, top drawer of the tool chest? As David numbly complied, he saw Bartholomew Thorne standing. On his own perfectly manicured lawn, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. The puppet had cut his own strings, and the master was exposed. Thorne met David's gaze for a fleeting second before scurrying back inside his house, the screen door slamming shut with a guilty clap. He had monumentally, catastrophically miscalculated, ever, dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. The aftermath was a flurry of flashing blue and red lights that painted the beige houses in alien colors. The scent of rain finally broke from the bruised purple clouds as two sheriff's deputies took a stammering, handcuffed Carl away. Maya gave her statement with a calm, factual precision that left the officers looking at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She downplayed her own credentials, merely identifying herself as a federal employee with extensive training. The deputy, a young man with a serious face, handed her a card. If you have any more trouble from these people, you call me directly, he said, his eyes flicking toward Thorne's dark house. When the last cruiser pulled away, the silence that fell was heavier than before. The streetlights hissed on, casting long shadows across the damp pavement. Inside, the smell of brewing coffee slowly replaced the smell of adrenaline. That was a tactical escalation, David said, his hand still not entirely steady as he held his mug. Maya looked up from her laptop, a small, wry smile touching her lips. In my world, we call that asymmetric warfare. Thorne has the home field advantage. He has the bylaws, the board, the perception of authority. We can't beat him by playing his game. So we change the battlefield. And the new battlefield is legal, public, and financial, she said, tapping her screen. Carl's arrest is the first shot in our counteroffensive. Thorne hired an unstable, poorly trained guard through a company that is now liable for his actions. He threatened your daughter with a firearm on your property. This is no longer about roses and bird feeders. This is about endangerment. We have leverage. For the next 2 days, David's quiet, grief-filled house transformed into a command center. Maya directed the operation with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned commander. They worked at the dining room table, surrounded by stacks of paper, HOA covenants, property deeds, financial statements David had requested as a homeowner, and printouts of Florida statutes. The air hummed with the low click of keyboard keys and the scent of determination. David, using the same methodical precision he once used to analyze blueprints, created a spreadsheet, a dossier of Thorne's reign. He documented every fine, every violation notice, and cross-referenced them with the homeowners. A pattern emerged. The fines weren't levied evenly. They were targeted. "Look at this," David said, pointing to a highlighted row. "The Gables, at the end of the cul-de-sac, fined $2,000 for having a satellite dish visible from the street, yet 3 board members have identical dishes." "And the Rodriguez family," Maya added, reading from her own notes. "Fined weekly because their son's basketball hoop is left out overnight. They're renters. Thorne is pressuring their landlord to evict them." The scope of Thorne's tyranny was broader than David had imagined. He wasn't the only target. He was just the first one to fight back in a way Thorne hadn't anticipated. Maya stood up and paced the room. "We need allies. People are scared. Thorne holds all the power because they think he's invincible. Carl's arrest might change that. It shows Thorne can bleed." That evening, guided by his spreadsheet, David walked down the street. It was the first time in months he'd done so with a purpose, other than a solitary, mournful walk. He knocked on the Gables' door first. The scent of lavender and old books emanated from the house. Eleanor Gable, a woman in her late 70s, with kind, fearful eyes, listened to him, her hands twisting a dish towel. "Oh, that Mr. Thorne," she whispered, after letting him in. "He's a terror. My Henry needs the satellite for his news programs. We can't afford the fines, but what can we do? He's the president." "He's a bully, Eleanor," David said gently. "And we're trying to prove that he's breaking the law, not enforcing it. Would you be willing to provide a copy of your fine notices? Anonymously, if you prefer." She hesitated, her gaze drifting to a photo of her husband on the mantelpiece. Then, a spark of the defiance David felt himself ignited in her eyes. "Anonymously? No. Henry didn't back down from a fight in his life, and I won't either. Let me get the paperwork." It was the same at the Rodriguez house, a young couple trying to make ends meet, their faces etched with worry. They spoke of constant harassment, of Thorne driving by their house slowly, multiple times a day. They gave David their paperwork, their voices filled with a desperate hope. By the time he returned home, he had a small stack of documents and a handful of stories, each a separate brushstroke in a larger portrait of abuse. The HOA wasn't protecting property values. It was feeding one man's insatiable appetite for control. A true, bona fide scandal was brewing, and they were about to blow the lid off. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. As they collated the new evidence, Maya unearthed their second and most powerful piece of ammunition. Her eyes were bright with the thrill of discovery. "Dad, you are not going to believe this. I've been reading up on Florida Statute 720, the Homeowners Association Act. It's dense, but it's got some real teeth." She turned her laptop toward him. "It's called the Sunshine Law. It applies to most government bodies, but a specific provision extends it to HOAs. All board meetings must be open to all members, and homeowners have the right to speak on any designated agenda item. But this is the kicker. The minutes of these meetings are official records. Homeowners have a right to inspect and copy them." David leaned in, the implication dawning on him. "You think he's been cooking the books?" "Worse," Maya said, a grim smile on her face. "I think he's been skipping the process entirely. Eleanor said the board just decides things. Mr. Rodriguez said he's never even seen a notice for a board meeting. If Thorne and his cronies have been levying fines and making decisions outside of properly noticed, minuted meetings, then almost every action they've taken could be legally void. It's not just a procedural error. It's a systemic, illegal abuse of the power they were granted." We need to demand the minutes for the last 5 years. It was a brilliant legal flanking maneuver. They weren't just fighting the fines. They were challenging the very legitimacy of the board's authority to issue them. Their formal written request for the meeting minutes, sent via certified mail, was met with a chilling silence. For a week, nothing happened. The security van was gone. No new notices appeared. An unsettling quiet fell over Cypress Creek. David felt a sliver of hope that Thorne had finally backed down, but he had underestimated his enemy's vindictiveness. Thorne wasn't retreating. He was reloading with heavier artillery. The midpoint twist came not in an HOA envelope, but in a County 1. A stern, official-looking man from Polk County Code Enforcement showed up, his truck smelling of diesel and authority. He walked the property with a clipboard, his face impassive. He didn't look at Helen's garden, but at the small, unassuming shed in the backyard where David kept his tools. This structure is in violation of County Ordinance 14-2B, the man said, his voice flat. Any accessory dwelling unit over 100 square feet requires a permit and must be set back at least 10 feet from the property line. Yours is at 8 feet. David was stunned. The shed had been there for 25 years. It was part of the original property plans. That can't be right. It's always been there. The county is doing a new round of compliance inspections, the man said, though he didn't meet David's eyes. He handed him a violation notice. The penalty was $500, a day until the structure was moved or demolished. You have 30 days to comply. As the truck pulled away, David felt the ground crumble beneath him. This wasn't Thorne's usual petty harassment. This was the full weight of the county government. A quick search of the county website confirmed the ordinance was real, though obscure and rarely enforced on pre-existing structures. How had they even noticed it? Then Maya, looking out the window, saw it. Bartholomew Thorne, standing on his porch, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face as he sipped from a coffee mug. The connection was immediate and sickening. Thorne hadn't just been a county commissioner, he still had friends in the system. He'd used his political leverage to turn a personal vendetta into an official county action. What they did next almost made me lose everything. But it also gave me the win of my life. The next 60 seconds will show you exactly how a single document can destroy an entire HOA. That night, the mood in the house was grim. The county violation felt like a checkmate. David was exhausted, the fight draining him more than he wanted to admit. Maybe I should just move the shed, he said, his voice heavy with defeat. Tear out the roses, just make it stop. Maya looked at him, her expression firm. No, don't you see? He just made his biggest mistake. Before, this was an HOA dispute. He just used his political influence to weaponize a government agency against a private citizen to settle a personal score. He's crossed the line from being a corrupt HOA president to being a corrupt former public official. He thinks he's untouchable, but he just handed us the key to his own destruction. She was right. The fight had escalated, but so had the stakes for Thorne. They spent the next 2 days compiling every piece of their research into a single damning dossier. Thorne's targeted fines, the sworn affidavits from the Gables and the Rodriguezes, the illegal security guard incident report, the lack of public meeting notices, and now, a timeline linking their request for HOA minutes directly to the retaliatory county violation. It was a meticulous, undeniable narrative of corruption. They were ready. They found a lawyer, a sharp, highly rated attorney in Lakeland named Evelyn Chen, who specialized in property law and litigation against HOAs. Her office was modern and minimalist, smelling of clean leather and freshly brewed espresso. Ms. Chen listened patiently, her face unreadable, as they laid out the entire story, spreading their documents across her glass conference table. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment, her long fingers steepled under her chin. She reviewed the county violation, then the timeline, then the affidavits from the neighbors. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. Mr. Miller, she said, her voice a low, controlled hum of professional fury. What you have here is not just a case against your HOA. What you have is a potential class action lawsuit for harassment and breach of fiduciary duty. And what Mr. Thorne has done with this county violation, that borders on a criminal conspiracy. This is the kind of case that doesn't just get a lien removed. This is the kind of case that gets an entire HOA dissolved and its president investigated by the state attorney. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. The question is, how far are you willing to take this? She picked up a pen, its silver tip gleaming under the recessed lighting, and held it poised over a fresh legal pad. The pen hovered, a fulcrum upon which justice and ruin balanced, waiting for his command. David looked across the polished glass table at Evelyn Chen, then at his daughter. He saw in Maya's eyes the same unwavering resolve she'd shown on his lawn when facing down a loaded gun. It was the same look his wife, Helen, used to get when she was defending something she loved. He felt the ghost of Helen's hand on his shoulder, a familiar, encouraging weight. The exhaustion he'd felt moments before burned away, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. He had started this fight to protect a memory, but it had become a battle for the soul of his community. "Ms. Chen," David said, his voice quiet but solid as bedrock. "My wife spent 30 years turning our little patch of dirt into something beautiful. She believed that you fight for the things you love, not because you're guaranteed to win, but because they are worth fighting for." Bartholomew Thorne tried to bulldoze her legacy for his own pathetic ego. He terrorized my neighbors and weaponized the law to intimidate good people. So, to answer your question, we take this all the way. We're not just here to stop him. We're here to dismantle his entire illegal operation. Evelyn Chen's professional smile widened into a genuine predatory grin. She clicked her pen. "Excellent. I love it when a client has a moral compass and a steel spine. Let's get to work." The first shot of the legal war was fired not with a bang, but with the quiet thud of a court clerk's filing stamp. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal devastation. Ms. Chen had woven David's meticulous records, the witness affidavits from the Gables and Rodriguezes, the police report, from Carl's arrest, and the damning timeline of the county violation into an inescapable narrative. The charges were explicit: breach of fiduciary duty, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil conspiracy, and malicious abuse of power. It named Bartholomew Thorne personally, along with the 2 board members who had rubber-stamped his every decree. The lawsuit triggered the discovery phase, the legal equivalent of a tactical team kicking in a door. Thorne's emails, the HOA's internal financial records, the minutes he never held, they were all subject to subpoena. Thorne's initial response through a blustering local lawyer was that the lawsuit was a frivolous and vexatious attempt to undermine the board's authority. That bluster evaporated when the first trove of documents landed on Ms. Chen's desk. "Bingo," she said, her voice electric during a call with David and Maya. "We have the bank statements. The payments to Cypress Creek Security were paid out of the Community Landscaping Fund. There's no board resolution, no vote, no record of approval in any of the minutes Thorne actually bothered to fabricate. He misappropriated HOA funds to hire a private goon to intimidate you. But the real smoking gun, the document that would utterly destroy Thorne, was buried in his emails, which his lawyer was forced to produce. It was an exchange between Thorne's personal email address and the official county email of a man named Marcus Rohrer, the head of Polk County Code Enforcement. Plow. First email from Thorne read, "Mark, hope the fishing's been good. I'm having a small issue with a resident at 1428 Cypress Point Lane, a real troublemaker. I'd consider it a significant personal favor if your department could take a close look at his property, find something, anything. Let's remind him how the system works. Drinks are on me. Bart." The reply from Rohrer came 2 days later. "Consider it done. Found an old shed violation. Notice is on its way. That'll quiet him down." He put it in writing. David breathed, staring at the printout. The scent of toner ink felt like the smell of victory. He was arrogant enough to put it all in writing. "Bullies always are," Maya said, her voice tight with vindicated anger. "They believe they're so far above the rules they don't even need to cover their tracks." This email transformed the case. It was no longer one man's word against another's. It was a clear, documented conspiracy to use a public office for personal retribution. The scandal was no longer just about the HOA, it was about county corruption. Ms. Chen immediately forwarded the exchange to the Florida State Attorney's Office. The ground beneath Bartholomew Thorne was beginning to splinter. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below, and I might cover it. The final showdown was not in a sterile courtroom, but in the stale, beige community clubhouse where Thorne had reigned supreme for years. An emergency HOA meeting was called, mandated by the lawsuit's preliminary motions. The room was packed. Every seat was filled, with residents standing along the walls, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. The air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee, damp wool from the recent rain, and palpable tension. Thorne sat at the head table with his two remaining board members, looking pale but defiant. He gripped a gavel in his hand, a useless wooden prop against the tidal wave of paper and truth about to crash down on him. He attempted to open the meeting with his usual blend of condescension and control. As you all know, he began, his voice straining for its usual authoritative tone, a disgruntled resident has filed a baseless lawsuit against your board. These are simply the actions of a man who refuses to follow the same rules as the rest of us. Mr. Thorne, if I may. Evelyn Chen's voice cut through his speech like glass. She stood from her seat in the front row, a thick binder in her hands. She was calm, poised, and radiated an authority that made Thorne's gavel look like a child's toy. My client, Mr. Miller, has ceded his time to me, and I have a few documents I'm sure the other homeowners would be very interested in seeing. Thorne's face flushed. This is not a courtroom, Ms. Chen. There are procedures. I'm well aware, she said, walking to the front of the room, which is why I'd like to begin with the minutes from the board meeting on June 12th, where you all supposedly voted to hire Cypress Creek Security, except there was no meeting on June 12th, was there? In fact, these bank statements, obtained under subpoena, show you paid Carl Matthews Company over $5,000 directly from the landscaping fund. She projected the bank statement onto a screen they had set up. A collective gasp went through the room. People began murmuring, turning to their neighbors. The faces that had once been fearful were hardening with anger. That was an emergency. Expenditure, one of the board members stammered. An emergency? Ms. Chen countered, her voice dangerously soft. An emergency that required hiring a man who would later be arrested for pulling a gun on the daughter of the very resident you were targeting? Let's talk about another emergency. The Gables' satellite dish. You fined them $2,000. Yet, Mr. Thorne, your own dish is clearly visible from the street, an interesting interpretation of the rules. She moved through her evidence with surgical precision. The targeted fines, the harassment of the Rodriguez family, the utter lack of procedural integrity. With each new revelation, Thorne seemed to shrink, the carefully constructed edifice of his power crumbling before the eyes of the very people he had terrorized. The final devastating blow was the email. And finally, Ms. Chen said, her voice ringing with clarity, for anyone who still believes Mr. Thorne was acting in the community's best interest, I present to you an email he sent to the head of County Code Enforcement. She projected the email onto the screen. The damning words filled the room. Find something, anything. Let's remind him how the system works. A dead silence fell. It was the silence of complete and utter ruin. Every homeowner in that room now saw Thorne not as a leader, but as a corrupt, vindictive bully who had used them, their money, and his political connections for a petty feud. The illusion was shattered. Justice was coming. And it was coming. Now, Thorne slammed his hand on the table. This is an illegal invasion of my privacy. These are lies. This entire HOA is under attack. You're right about one thing, Ms. Chen said, turning to address the stunned homeowners. This HOA is under attack. It's been under attack from the inside for years. The crowd erupted. Shouts of resign and thief rained down on the head table. It was in this moment of chaos that Ms. Chen delivered the final knowledge bomb, the one that would not just end Thorne's reign, but empower the entire community. For those of you who feel trapped, she called. Out over the noise, her voice a beacon of legal clarity. Please know that Florida law provides a solution. According to Florida Statute 720, if a board is found to have acted in a manner that is fraudulent or criminal, a petition signed by a majority of homeowners can trigger a judicial review for the complete dissolution of the homeowners association. You are not powerless. You have the right to reclaim your community. That was it, the kill shot. The idea that they could not just remove the tyrant but tear down the entire corrupt kingdom was a revelation. It was the ultimate path to justice. Motion was made from the floor for a vote of no confidence in Bartholomew Thorne. It was seconded by a dozen voices at once. The vote was a deafening, unanimous aye. Thorne, his face the color of ash, was stripped of his presidency on the spot. His two cronies resigned before a vote could be held on them, scurrying out of the room to a chorus of boos. In less than an hour, the entire corrupt power structure had been exposed and dismantled. 6 months later, the Florida sun streamed down on Cypress Creek. The air smelled different. It smelled of freshly cut grass, yes, but also of barbecue smoke, of chlorine from a newly installed backyard pool, of life. The oppressive, manicured silence had been replaced by the sound of children's laughter. The Rodriguez boys' basketball hoop was back, its net swishing as he practiced layups. Eleanor Gable was the interim president of the new scaled-back HOA, and her first act had been to rescind every punitive fine Thorne had ever issued. David stood on his lanai, a glass of iced tea in his hand. The bird feeder in the old oak tree was a flurry of color: cardinals, blue jays, goldfinches. His gaze fell upon Helen's garden. It was thriving. The climbing clematis now wound its way up the new trellis he had built for it. The Evelyn roses were in full, glorious bloom, their sweet, peppery scent a constant, comforting presence. He reached out and touched a soft pink petal. The boot print was long gone. The soil was healed. He had not only protected her memory, he had honored it. He had fought for something beautiful, and in doing so, had let the light back into not just his own life, but the lives of his neighbors. The fight against Bartholomew Thorne had ended, but David's had not. The story of the Cypress Creek takedown had spread, and now he spent his Tuesdays advising a group of homeowners from a nearby county on how to audit their own HOA's financials. He'd learned that bullies are everywhere, hiding in plain sight, wrapped in the thin cloak of petty authority. But he'd also learned that they are, without exception, cowards. Their power is a fragile illusion built on the belief that no one will ever dare to check the receipts, read the fine print, or stand up and fight back. They are always, always wrong. Justice isn't something that just happens. It's a structure. You have to design it, build it from a solid foundation of truth, and engineer it to withstand any pressure. You have to fight for it. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. Like, share and tag a friend who needs to hear this. The more people know, the harder it is for them to get away with it.